The world is silent except for the low groan of the wind as it slides across endless sheets of ice. A sound so constant it becomes a kind of heartbeat for the frozen plains. Beneath a pale winter sun, the horizon glitters with sharp reflections, shards of frozen light cast across snow that stretches further than the eye can follow. Yet within this vastness warmth flickers. A fire crackles at the center of a small gathering, its glow pushing back the dark, its smoke curling into the night sky. Around it sit people who are both fragile and formidable, clothed in layered hides stitched with bone needles, bodies pressed close for warmth, faces hardened by years of cold, yet softened by the glow of community. Every breath they take crystallizes in the air, dissolving almost instantly into the vast emptiness. Every gesture, passing a piece of roasted meat, adjusting a fur wrap, tightening the frame of a shelter, carries weight. Because here, in this landscape of relentless cold, survival is an art of detail. This is not the story of brutish cave dwellers huddled in fear, but of thinkers, builders, and sharers who created systems of life more advanced, more resilient, and more nuanced than history often admits. Tonight, you will step into their world, not to observe from a distance, but to feel the warmth of their fire, to sense the rhythm of their survival, and to understand how ingenuity, community, and balance allowed them to endure winters that could erase the unprepared in days. This is the story of how cavemen actually survived freezing winters. The wind whispers across an endless canvas of white, carrying with it the weight of an unforgiving season. Every gust a reminder that here, in the frozen heart of the Ice Age, survival was never guaranteed, and yet, in this world of bitter cold and vast silence, life not only endured but thrived through ingenuity, cooperation, and a deep understanding of the land. The snow lay thick across plains that glittered cruelly under a pale, distant sun. Mammoths moved in slow procession with tusks rising like frozen crescents of ivory, their shadows stretching across the horizon and within the hollows of valleys, where the wind bent less harshly. Smoke curled into the sky, fragile banners of human defiance against the endless winter. Around the hearths that glowed in these shelters, firelight painted faces hardened by years of endurance, yet softened by warmth and community. And every gesture, passing roasted meat, tightening the lashings of hides, adjusting a fur-lined hood, carried meaning because in this place, detail was survival, and nothing could be left to chance. Shelters of mammoth-bone frames, lashed with sinew and covered in hides, rose like organic fortresses against the elements, insulated with layers of moss, grasses, and earth, their interiors lined with furs and heated stones placed beneath bedding to radiate warmth through the long, dark nights. Each architectural choice reflecting knowledge passed through generations, a living technology carved from trial, error, and memory. Clothing told another story, bone needles piercing tough hides, sinew thread binding layers into tailored garments designed not just for insulation, but for flexibility, mobility, and identity. Hoods lined with fox fur for softness, boots stuffed with dried grasses to wick moisture, seams reinforced with instinctive engineering, while decorative stitches, beads, and patterns transformed garments into signals of belonging, family ties, and personal expression. Proof that even here at the edge of survival, aesthetics and symbolism could flourish. Food was the heart of continuity, and Ice Age diets were an intricate system of hunting, foraging, preservation, and sharing with mammoths, bison, and woolly rhinoceroses providing not only meat but fat, hides, bones, and tusks, their carcasses carefully dismantled into resources that fueled life itself, while smaller game, fish, berries, roots, and nuts diversified the palate and ensured balance, and every meal was communal, binding individuals into networks of trust and reciprocity where one hunter's success became the nourishment of all. And in return, the group ensured the survival of children, elders, and injured members, creating a system where strength was measured not in individual might, but in collective resilience. Around the fire, roasted meat sizzled on stones placed in embers, smoke rising with fragrance that broke through the heavy air. Hands passed portions with deliberation, elders guiding children, and words flowed with the cadence of survival itself. Stories embedding knowledge of animals, migrations, weather, and ethics into narratives that carried culture forward without need of writing. Oral traditions becoming both library and compass, myth and manual. Each tale a vessel of memory that fortified the mind as much as food strengthened the body. But survival was never only about endurance, it was also about artistry and meaning. with walls of caves illuminated by torchlight bearing images of mammoths, horses and bison painted in ochre, charcoal and mineral pigments, each stroke of pigment carrying ritual, lesson or commemoration, while carved figures and etched tools revealed that expression and symbolism thrived in tandem with practical necessity, proving that Ice Age life was not a void of brutality, but a culture steeped in reflection and creativity. Music rose alongside this art, bone flutes carved with patience releasing notes that drifted into frozen nights, rhythms tapped on stone and wood uniting voices in song, and laughter cut through the dark, humor itself becoming a form of resilience, easing burdens, binding communities, and transforming hardship into a shared experience lightened by joy. Yet beneath all of this lay a foundation of care, of empathy woven into survival, with skeletal remains showing healed fractures that would have demanded weeks of attention, proof that the injured were not abandoned but protected, fed, and carried. Children raised not by individuals but by entire networks of kin. Knowledge shared across generations through demonstration and ritual, and leadership fluid, shifting to whoever carried the knowledge most necessary for the moment, whether in hunting, foraging, shelter building, or healing, revealing societies that were not primitive hierarchies but adaptive systems of equality, fluidity, and mutual dependence. The fire itself became the nucleus of existence, its glow extending beyond warmth and cooking into realms of memory, storytelling, ritual, and reflection, its crackle syncing with rhythms of speech and song, its light allowing the night to become a stage where myths took shape, where the past was retold, and where the future was imagined. And as one listens to these scenes unfold, one realizes that the Ice Age was not merely a tale of relentless struggle, but a dynamic era where intellect, artistry, and collaboration transformed vulnerability into strength, where life was not endured but actively designed, and where cavemen, so often mislabeled as brutish and crude, emerge instead as innovators, architects, and creators of meaning, who mastered the art of surviving freezing winters, not through instinct alone, but through intelligence, connection, and vision, reminding us that even in the harshest landscapes, humanity has always sought not only to live, but to live fully, richly, and with purpose. Shelter was more than a barrier against cold. It was the axis around which Ice Age existence turned, a fusion of engineering, intuition, and collective effort that transformed inhospitable landscapes into livable worlds. And when the winds howled across plains of snow or blizzards fell so thick the horizon disappeared, these structures stood as quiet miracles of adaptation, each one a testament to the intelligence and resourcefulness of early humans who refused to bow before the ice. Caves, when available, were not left bare but reshaped into homes, their cavernous hollows divided into zones where fire pits glowed at the center, smoke carefully vented through cracks or entrances. Sleeping platforms were raised with layers of woven branches topped with hides and furs, and pits carved into the ground served as storage chambers, insulated caches where meat, berries, or rendered fat could survive weeks without spoiling, turning nature's stone skeletons into warm, efficient sanctuaries. But not every region offered caves and so on open tundra and frozen plains. Humans built what the environment demanded. Circular huts of mammoth bones and tusks lashed with sinew, frames draped with hides and layered with turf or snow for insulation, roofs angled to shed winds, entrances facing leeward to minimize exposure, each detail refined through centuries of observation and adjustment, until even in temperatures that could sink far below freezing, the interiors held warmth, firelight flickered steady, and life pulsed with rhythm. These bone hut villages, uncovered by archaeologists in places like Ukraine and Siberia, reveal not random improvisations, but sophisticated architecture, with walls double layered for insulation, fire pits strategically placed to distribute heat, and layouts that reflected both efficiency and communal orientation, huts clustered to share warmth and protection, yet arranged to give each family its own sphere of daily life, showing an awareness of social balance as critical as thermal balance. Even snow itself, the very substance of winter's oppression, was repurposed as an ally, pressed into dense blocks and stacked into walls that deflected wind, dug into trenches that created semi-subterranean shelters where heat collected naturally, proving that Ice Age humans understood the materials of their world intimately, not as enemies to be endured but as resources to be shaped. Every shelter was layered with ingenuity, hides stitched into patchworks large enough to cover wide spans, sinew cords twisted to withstand tension, poles anchored with stones to prevent collapse in storms, and surfaces covered with moss, grasses, or even animal fat to add waterproofing. Each solution born not of theory but of lived necessity, tested against storms that could erase unprepared lives overnight. Inside, organization turned survival into comfort, with hearths placed for optimal smoke control, seating and sleeping arranged around fire for warmth, storage pits lined with stone or wood to protect food from pests, and personal spaces marked with objects, tools, ornaments, tokens that anchored identity within communal living. Light flickered across carved tusks, bone awls, beads strung into necklaces. Not luxuries, but reminders that even in shelters built against extinction, humans sought beauty and symbolism as surely as warmth. Children learned by watching the assembly of huts, hands small but eager, given tasks of binding, carrying, scraping, their participation not mere play but the earliest steps into cultural apprenticeship, ensuring knowledge of architecture passed forward like flame itself, never allowed to vanish. Shelters were more than houses. They were blueprints of thought, reflections of planning, cooperation, and anticipation. Each one evidence that these people were not trapped in reaction, but proactive shapers of their fates. To walk into one was to step into a living record of adaptation, where firelight made shadows dance across mammoth-bone frames, laughter and stories echoed under hide roofs, and warmth pressed back against the vast chill outside. Here, vulnerability was converted into security, cold into comfort, chaos into order. And this transformation did not happen through instinct alone, but through the sophisticated layering of observation, memory, and design. A knowledge system carried across miles of migration and across centuries of change. To call these people primitive is to deny the evidence of their architecture, which rivals modern ingenuity in its efficiency, sustainability, and context-specific precision. Shelters that used local materials entirely, recycled resources endlessly, and endured conditions that would collapse modern dwellings in hours. Even today, the thermal efficiency of semi-subterranean structures or bone hut insulation astonishes engineers, proof that necessity pushed the human mind toward solutions still relevant in a world grappling with energy, shelter, and sustainability. But beyond technology, these shelters were social engines, spaces where firelight drew people into circles of trust, where songs and myths were born, where children drifted to sleep listening to stories older than history, and where community itself became the strongest wall against the cold, because no shelter was simply physical, it was also psychological, a container of belonging, safety, and identity, and in that fusion of wood, bone, hide, fire, and story, humans created not just survival, but the first architecture of culture itself, homes that sheltered both bodies and souls, proving that even against the most brutal winters the planet has known, cavemen endured not as scattered individuals, but as builders of spaces where resilience and meaning intertwined. Clothing in the Ice Age was not a luxury, but a second skin, a carefully engineered defense against the relentless cold, designed with an intelligence that fused practicality, durability, and cultural identity. For without these layered furs and stitched hides, even the strongest body could not withstand the cutting winds that swept across tundra and steppe. To survive, people became artisans of warmth, working with materials harvested from the animals they hunted, transforming hides, sinew, bone, and fur into garments that insulated, protected, and signaled belonging. And the process began long before the sewing, with hunters skilled in skinning large animals so the hides could be preserved intact, scraped with flint blades until pliable, stretched on frames to dry, then softened with animal fat or brains in a labor-intensive process that turned stiff skin into supple leather capable of bending, folding, and being shaped into garments that resisted cracking in freezing air. Bone needles, finely carved from ribs or long bones, pierced this leather with precision. Sinew threads drawn from tendons were twisted into resilient cords, stronger than modern thread, and hours were spent stitching together panels of hide, layering fur inward for insulation or outward for display, producing coats, leggings, boots, hoods, and mittens tailored to fit the body snugly, while still allowing mobility across frozen terrain. Archaeological finds like those from Sungir in Russia reveal not only clothing stitched with thousands of tiny beads, but garments so finely made that their design anticipated modern cold weather wear, with multiple layers functioning like insulation systems. inner garments absorbing moisture, middle layers trapping warmth and outer layers blocking wind, an astonishing sophistication that belies the myth of crude, poorly clad cave dwellers. Footwear was perhaps the most ingenious, with boots stuffed with dried grasses or moss that wicked away sweat while insulating feet from frostbite, soles reinforced with hide or rawhide thongs to give traction on snow and ice, and designs varying by terrain, from moccasin-like shoes for forested ground to thicker fur-lined boots for open tundra, proving a regional awareness of environment that was reflected in the very cut of each garment. Head coverings and hoods were equally critical, often trimmed with fox or wolf fur that caught frost before it reached skin, while layered cloaks could be draped, removed or adjusted depending on exertion, allowing the body to regulate temperature in conditions where overheating could be as dangerous as freezing. But clothing was not only utilitarian, it was expressive. And here lies one of the most striking truths about Ice Age humans. That even under mortal threat from the cold, they adorned themselves, stitched beads into seams, wore pendants of bone, teeth, and shell, added fringes, dyes, and decorative stitching, transforming clothing into a language of identity, signaling family ties, group membership, or personal achievement. And this was no trivial indulgence, but a powerful social tool, because to wear decorated clothing was to carry a message of belonging and competence, markers that reinforced group cohesion and trust. Children likely wore miniature versions of adult garments, both functional and symbolic, initiating them into group identity while protecting them against the cold. While elders may have displayed more ornamentation, their clothing carrying markers of wisdom, status, or mythic resonance, embedding stories into stitches and beads. When groups came together for trade, ritual, or seasonal gatherings, clothing became a visible marker of difference and alliance, turning the body into a canvas for communication long before writing existed. And this layering of survival and symbolism reveals a people who did not see practicality and beauty as separate, but as interwoven, inseparable elements of existence. The production of clothing was itself a communal act, often carried out by groups of women who scraped, softened, sewed, and decorated hides together, their conversations and songs interlaced with the rhythm of needles piercing leather, the act becoming a space of knowledge sharing, bonding, and teaching, where techniques were passed to younger generations and innovations, like new stitching methods, better insulation strategies, or fresh patterns, were tested and adopted, proof that technology and culture advanced not through isolated flashes of genius, but through collective, generational practice. Every seam carried survival, every bead carried memory, and every fur-lined boot was a testament to human foresight and care. And even in burials, where bodies were interred with garments rich in decoration, it is clear that clothing transcended utility to embody status, belief, and respect, suggesting that warmth was more than physical. It was also spiritual, that the act of clothing the dead was as much about guiding them into another world as it was about honoring their place in this one. And so, when we picture Ice Age life, we must see not ragged skins draped crudely over bodies, but layered ensembles tailored with precision, stitched with beauty, and worn with meaning, a technology of survival so effective that it carried humans across frozen continents, into new territories, and through winters that could strip the land bare, proving once again that these so-called cavemen were not victims of their environment, but innovators who mastered it, wrapping themselves not only in furs and hides, but in knowledge, identity, and resilience woven into every thread. Food was the lifeblood of Ice Age survival, the constant rhythm beneath every hunt, every fire, every gathering. For without a steady flow of calories and fat, the human body could not endure the endless assault of the cold. And so survival became an intricate dance with the land, a web of strategies, skills, and rituals that turned raw wilderness into sustenance. Beginning with the great hunts, where men and women worked in fluid roles, not as lone predators but as cooperative tacticians capable of bringing down animals that dwarfed them in size and power, mammoths whose tusks curved like frozen moons, bison that thundered across plains in herds, and woolly rhinoceroses armored against the wind. And to capture such beasts required planning that spanned days, sometimes weeks, with knowledge of migration paths, waterholes, seasonal patterns, and animal behavior woven into the strategies that shaped each expedition. Hunters did not rely on brute strength, but on intelligence, using spears tipped with flint or bone, thrusting weapons designed for close encounters, and later adapted into throwing spears with atlatls that extended reach and force. turning a human arm into a lever of lethal precision. And when prey was cornered, driven toward cliffs, trapped in snow, or ambushed in narrow valleys, the kill became both triumph and responsibility, for nothing could be wasted. Every bone, hide, tendon, and morsel of meat transformed into food, shelter, tools, or thread. The carcass a library of resources that sustained life in countless forms. Fat was the true treasure of these hunts. Rich in calories, essential in freezing climates, rendered into tallow or marrow extracted from cracked bones, stored in skins or bladders to fuel fires and bodies during the lean months when hunting failed. And without this dense energy source, survival in the Ice Age would have been impossible. But the diet was never only about large animals, for resilience came from diversity, from fishing rivers thick with salmon and trout, setting bone hooks or woven nets, trapping hares and small mammals with snares, collecting eggs and gathering plants, roots, nuts, and berries during the brief summers, when tundra bloomed with sudden, furious life. These foods dried, smoked, or cached to stretch into winter, turning fleeting abundance into lasting security. Preservation was an art, with strips of meat hung above smoky fires to deter rot and insects, pits dug into permafrost soil to serve as natural refrigerators, fat mixed with dried meat to form portable energy bars not unlike modern pemmican. And this ability to stretch resources meant the difference between thriving and starvation, especially during brutal winters when fresh game became scarce. Cooperation was the unseen thread binding all this together. For a single hunter could not feed a group, but a group working together could feed all, and when an animal was brought down, its division followed patterns of reciprocity. Meat distributed not just to those who made the kill, but to families, elders, children, and even neighboring groups, a system that turned food into social glue, binding people in networks of trust, where generosity guaranteed future survival. Around fires, meals were shared with ceremony, fat sizzling on stones, bones cracked for marrow, soups brewed in hide-lined pits with hot rocks dropped into simmer broths, rich in protein and minerals. And these meals were more than nourishment. They were community embodied, the moment where survival transformed into connection, where stories were told, songs sung, and laughter shared even in the heart of winter. But hunting also carried risk and reverence, for to take life was to walk a boundary between necessity and respect. And many groups honored the animals they killed, engraving bones with their images, painting them on cave walls or placing tusks, skulls, and bones in ritual arrangements that suggested gratitude, remembrance, or even spiritual dialogue, as if to acknowledge that survival was a partnership with the living world, not domination of it. Children grew up inside this rhythm, watching hunts unfold, learning to recognize tracks in snow, practicing with miniature spears, listening to elders recount which plants could be eaten, which roots healed illness, and which berries poisoned, knowledge that was as vital as the food itself. For without this oral encyclopedia, survival would collapse. And when famine struck, when hunts failed, when blizzards closed in and the landscape fell silent, humans adapted still, turning to stored caches, scavenging frozen carcasses left by predators, chewing on dried hides softened in boiling water, eking survival from what seemed impossible. Proof that resilience was as much about endurance of spirit as cleverness of hand. In every bite of roasted meat, every sip of hot broth, and every shared portion, the truth is revealed that food was never merely fuel, but the very architecture of Ice Age life, a system of nutrition, strategy, preservation, and reciprocity that kept hearts beating and fires burning through winters so merciless they could erase the unprepared in days. And when we look back at these so-called cavemen, what we truly see are master survivalists, innovators who turned landscape into larder and necessity into culture, reminding us that even in the most frozen epochs, humanity's ingenuity ensured not just existence but continuity. Fire was more than warmth, more than light, more than protection. It was the axis around which Ice Age humanity revolved, the living element that transformed frozen nights into spaces of survival, connection, and meaning. And its mastery was no simple matter, for while lightning strikes, volcanic eruptions, or the chance ignition of dry brush could gift flame to wandering groups, the true art was not in stumbling upon it, but in keeping it alive, carrying it across landscapes in smouldering bundles of fungus or bark, nurturing embers through storms and migrations, coaxing sparks from flint and pyrite with patience and precision, an act that demanded skill so refined it bordered on ritual. The fire itself became a heartbeat in the center of camp, its crackle and glow defining the very boundaries of human habitation, pushing back predators whose eyes glimmered in the dark. Wolves, lions, and hyenas deterred by the shifting shadows, its smoke rising like a signal to the heavens, announcing that humans had claimed a corner of the frozen wilderness and bent it to their will. Around this nucleus of flame life unfolded in concentric rings, with cooking at its heart, meat roasted on stones, fat dripping into the embers to hiss and flare, roots softened and detoxified by heat, soups simmered with hot rocks plunged into hide-lined pits, and every meal became not only more digestible, but safer, richer in calories and easier on teeth worn down by grit, proving that fire was not merely a protector, but an alchemist that reshaped nutrition itself. But its gifts extended further still, for fire hardened wooden spear tips, tempered tools, and illuminated the dark recesses of caves, where paintings came alive under flickering light. Its glow casting mammoths, bison, and hunters onto stone walls in shifting animations that carried symbolic weight, turning fire into both stage and spotlight for early art and storytelling. And in these gatherings, where bodies huddled close and eyes followed sparks spiraling upward into the night, oral traditions were forged. Knowledge carried not in books, but in memory, spoken by elders whose words were embroidered with rhythm, cadence, and symbolism, stories of hunts, ancestors, spirits, and lessons woven into narratives that became the educational spine of Ice Age society. And in this setting, fire was both teacher and witness, the silent participant in every exchange. Music too was born in its circle, bone flutes echoing the wind, drums tapping rhythms of the heart, voices rising together, laughter mingling with song, until the camp itself pulsed like a single organism, warmed not only by heat, but by emotion, trust, and shared experience. Yet fire had darker sides as well, its danger respected and feared, for a spark could destroy precious shelters, and careless handling could sear flesh or blind eyes. So rules grew up around its tending. Who could stoke? Who could carry embers? How coals were banked overnight with ash to preserve them, and how torches were lit for hunting or ritual. These practices binding generations to techniques that combined observation, discipline, and reverence. In many groups, fire became a spiritual entity, a living presence that consumed offerings of fat or bone, its smoke carrying prayers, its light linked to the sun, its cyclic nature mirrored in human life and death. And this symbolic resonance transformed the act of tending fire into an act of devotion, a merging of survival and spirituality that deepened its place in daily life. Physiologically, fire extended human reach, allowing warmth deep into freezing nights, permitting winter camps to exist in places that would otherwise have been lethal, lengthening waking hours for planning, crafting, and bonding. While psychologically, it created zones of safety, circles of light where anxiety ebbed, predators receded and the mind could rest, reflect, or dream, its flickering glow inducing states of calm that modern humans still recognize when staring into campfires, an echo of ancient neural circuits shaped by countless nights of fire-gazing. And because fire allowed the cooking of meat, the release of nutrients, and the softening of food, it amplified health, supporting the growth of brains and bodies alike, tying the mastery of flame directly to the cognitive and cultural explosion of Ice Age humanity. But perhaps its greatest legacy was the community it enforced. For a single person could not easily sustain fire across long winters, but a group could, and so tending flames became a shared task, passing from hand to hand, parent to child, elder to youth, ensuring continuity across hours, days, years, and generations. Each coal carried in bark bundles across tundra, a thread connecting lives. When we trace the history of fire in the Ice Age, we see not merely a technological achievement, but the birth of a social nucleus, a place where survival, innovation, art, ritual, memory, and identity fused into one, where the flame's warmth became indistinguishable from the warmth of human bonds themselves. And in its light, humanity learned not only to endure the cold, but to define itself. Shelter was the second skin of Ice Age humanity, a barrier between fragile bodies and the merciless climate. And while furs and fire shielded the individual, true survival required spaces where entire groups could withdraw, heal, and plan, places that converted hostile landscapes into habitable worlds. And these shelters were marvels of ingenuity, whether carved by nature in the form of caves, or raised by human hands from bone, hide, and earth. Each design reflecting an intimate knowledge of materials, weather, and community needs. Caves offered the first refuge, dark recesses insulated by stone, where entrances could be walled with hides to block winds, hearths set near central points for even distribution of heat, and walls transformed into canvases of both art and information, bearing marks that blended ritual with memory, maps of hunts, constellations, and animals drawn in pigment that flickered alive under firelight, making the shelter not just protection, but a living record of identity. Yet caves were not always available, so nomadic groups innovated with astonishing creativity, building circular structures from mammoth bones, tusks serving as ribs, jawbones forming foundations, frames lashed with sinew, covered in thick hides layered like shingles, sometimes insulated further with earth or snow, creating warm, durable dwellings that could withstand blizzards and fierce winds, while smaller hide tents, stretched over wooden poles, provided portable solutions for migrations, quick to erect and disassemble, balancing mobility with survival. These homes were more than mere cover. They were carefully engineered microclimates, with hearths positioned to minimize smoke while maximizing heat, vents cut for airflow, floors lined with furs, and raised sleeping platforms that kept bodies above the cold ground, all reflecting a sophisticated understanding of thermal efficiency long before science named it. Storage pits dug into the earth or carved into cave floors kept food safe from predators and decay, while tool racks, work areas, and child spaces revealed a deliberate spatial organization that mirrored the priorities of survival: warmth, safety, accessibility, and cooperation. These dwellings also became the stage for social life, where firelight cast families into circles of song, laughter, teaching, and ritual, where the bonds of the group were reinforced nightly against the howling winds outside. Structurally, they reflected resilience, able to withstand not just climate but time, with archaeological remains of mammoth-bone houses still standing after tens of thousands of years, silent testimonies to the durability of design born of necessity and vision. And beyond functionality, shelters carried meaning, turning barren plains into home, giving psychological stability by creating familiar, ordered environments in the midst of chaos, so that children grew up with a sense of belonging, elders rested with dignity, and the sick or injured found places to recover shielded from exposure. Even the placement of camps reflected strategy, chosen near rivers, hunting grounds, or natural windbreaks, balancing resource access with defense, and sometimes shifting seasonally in rhythm with migrations of game, so that shelter was not fixed architecture but part of a larger choreography of survival. Inside, decoration extended beyond utility, with beads hung from hides, carved objects placed near hearths, and patterns stitched into clothing doubling as aesthetic and symbolic expression. Evidence that even in the harshest conditions humans sought beauty, identity, and meaning, suggesting that comfort was not only physical but cultural. Shelters were thus extensions of the body and the mind, protective cocoons that nurtured creativity, memory, and intimacy, where stories were told and skills passed down, where grief and celebration alike were held in collective space, where survival became community rather than isolation. And so, when we think of Ice Age homes, we should not imagine crude caves or haphazard tents, but carefully designed living systems, resilient, organized, multifunctional, and deeply human. Structures that turned snow-swept tundra into habitable terrain and proved that even in an age of scarcity and danger, humans never accepted bare endurance, but reshaped their world with intelligence, adaptability, and artistry, building not just shelter but home. Clothing was the first line of defense against the Ice Age's merciless cold, yet it was also one of humanity's earliest art forms, a fusion of survival technology and cultural expression that wrapped fragile bodies in warmth while weaving identity, memory, and meaning into every stitch. For in a world where frost could pierce lungs and winds could freeze flesh in minutes, garments had to do more than cover skin. They had to create portable shelters, flexible enough for hunting, yet insulated enough for sleep. And so Ice Age humans learned the craft of layering, stitching together hides and furs with astonishing precision, cutting and shaping them into tunics, leggings, boots, and hoods that covered every vulnerable surface, sometimes with double or triple layers depending on season, their seams sealed with sinew threads drawn tight by bone needles, the needles themselves among the earliest symbols of human ingenuity. For with a polished eyelet at one end and a sharpened point at the other, they allowed hides to be transformed from rough coverings into fitted garments tailored to the contours of the body, reducing exposure, conserving heat, and permitting free movement across snow-laden plains. Boots were lined with fur, soles reinforced with rawhide for traction and durability, gloves fashioned from layered skins to protect fingers critical for tool-making and weapon use, while cloaks draped over shoulders offered both insulation and ceremonial presence, creating a silhouette that was as much symbolic as practical. Yet clothing was never uniform or purely functional. It carried stories, identities, and messages with decorative stitching, patterned furs, beads, teeth, and shells sewn into seams, turning every garment into a tapestry of status, affiliation, or achievement. Where the placement of a certain color of bead or the spiral of sinew thread embroidery could signal lineage, hunting skill, or spiritual connection. Evidence that humans, even in prehistory, never settled for bare necessity.